There is a village nestled where the hills fold like blankets under a misty sky, so distant and quiet that maps rarely bother marking it. The roads that lead there twist and wind as if unsure of their purpose, narrowing to single paths where wild grasses reach out like fingers. The people who live there do not rush. They live by rhythm, of seasons, of harvests, of the ancient bell that tolls not for time, but for memory. Houses are wooden, slanted from age, their shutters closed more often than open. Smoke curls from chimneys even in spring, and lanterns are lit at dusk regardless of whether the sun still lingers. This is a place wrapped in old traditions, where tales are currency and silence is a virtue. Children are taught early to listen before speaking, to observe before questioning, and above all, never to pry. What one sees is only part of what exists. What one hears is not always what is meant. Secrets live in this village, not in dark corners, but in plain view, wrapped in customs, hidden in polite smiles, buried beneath generations of "this is how it has always been." And the villagers do not question. Not out loud. Not directly. Some stories, they say, are not for telling. If you stand in the center of the village at twilight, when the air stills and birds quiet, you might hear it, the wind that rushes through the trees with urgency, not random, but purposeful. It rattles windows. It pulls at scarves. It whispers. Those born here sometimes pause in their steps, turning their heads slightly, as if listening to an old friend or a long-dead relative. They never speak of what they hear, but their eyes betray a flicker of memory or fear. It is said that when the wind howls just right, when it dips low through the chimneys and curls around door frames, it carries the voice of something forgotten. Not a ghost, no. Ghosts are easy to name and banish. This is older, deeper. Some call it a warning. Others call it a promise. But everyone agrees on this: it is not to be ignored. The elders speak only in metaphors, half-truths wrapped in riddles. Keep your doors closed during the blue hour, they say. Not all guests knock. Or, never look too long at a closed window, some things look back. Children grow up learning to accept these warnings as naturally as the changing of leaves. But there's one story, old and mostly unsaid, that clings to the bones of the village like ivy on stone. It is not found in books or told at hearthsides. It lives in the way people avert their eyes when passing a certain house. In the silence that follows if her name is accidentally spoken. They do not speak of her, the one who was hidden. Not out of shame, but out of fear. Not because they forgot her, but because remembering makes the air too still, and the wind too loud. They hid her in the back room when guests came. But one day, a visitor came and asked for her by name. The Harrow house stood at the edge of the village, nestled in the arms of a dark wood that seemed to lean toward it, as though listening for secrets. It was grand in a way that no other home in the village was: larger, older, built of heavy stone and timber that had blackened with age. Its slanted roof loomed high, chimneys rising like crooked fingers, and its windows were narrow and tall, with iron-latticed glass that caught the light like old eyes, reflective, but never revealing. The villagers called it the House of Silent Shadows, though never to the family's face. It was not that the Harrows were cruel or unkind. They paid their dues, hired local workers, even donated generously to the seasonal festivals. But there was something about them that inspired unease. The Harrow name carried with it a weight that couldn't be measured in coin or status, but in the pause it created in conversation, in the way children were hushed when they passed the gate, in how even the dogs refused to bark too loudly when they approached its perimeter. Inside, the house was colder than the air outside, no matter the season. The great hall, with its twin staircases and faded velvet drapes, always seemed dimmer than it should be, even on bright afternoons. Portraits lined the walls, but no one could remember who painted them or when. Each face wore a look of quiet command: high cheekbones, long eyes, pale skin. The Harrow bloodline was strong and pure, as old as the village itself. Perhaps older. But it was the doors that drew the most attention. There were too many. More than a house of its size should have. Some opened to rooms filled with antique furniture covered in dustless sheets, others to closets with nothing inside but a single candle. A few didn't open at all. Their keyholes had been filled with wax, and over them hung heavy charms of iron and braided ash wood. If a guest reached for a handle they shouldn't, a servant would appear, soundless and stern, and gently guide them away without a word. Guests were rare, but not forbidden. The harrows hosted dignitaries from distant towns, merchants of fine goods, scholars with questions and scrolls. They were offered wine from cellars deep beneath the house, meals served in silence on silver so old its pattern had worn smooth. Conversation at the table was minimal. Every guest, without exception, was told the same: do not go upstairs, and do not open any doors that are closed. The warning was never cruel, only careful, like someone reminding you not to step on a fragile bridge. Some visitors, emboldened by curiosity or pride, tried to explore when they thought no one watched. Those who did never found anything overtly strange, only an overwhelming sense of being unwelcome in certain corners. A door that wouldn't budge, no matter how they pushed. A hallway that seemed to lengthen unnaturally as they walked it. And in every shadowed place, the feeling of being observed. Not by the harrows, but by the house itself. Among all the curiosities, the most persistent whispers centered on the youngest daughter, Leora. Most villagers had never seen her. Some claimed she didn't exist, that she had died in infancy, and the harrows, proud and superstitious, had created a fiction to hide the loss. Others swore they had seen a pale face behind an upper window, eyes too wide and too still, watching as if from underwater. There were stories of crying in the night, of light flickering in rooms no one entered, of strange singing carried on the wind. The harrows never acknowledged the rumors. They never spoke of Leora in public. When asked how many children they had, Lady Harrow would simply say, 2 sons, and nothing more. If pressed, her expression would harden, not with anger, but with finality. Servants who worked at the house never mentioned her. In fact, they seemed trained to avoid any mention of the upstairs entirely. Questions about the upper floors were met with polite redirects. Would you care for tea in the garden, or I'm afraid I don't know, shall I fetch the master? None of them ever stayed long. The Harrow household cycled through staff faster than any other in the village, and those who left rarely spoke of their time there. One girl, who worked as a scullery maid, moved away suddenly and was never seen again. Her mother said only that she'd come home changed and refused to explain further. Behind closed doors, the villagers speculated wildly. Some said Leora was ill, stricken by a wasting sickness that made her too fragile to see the sun. Others believed she was mad, hidden away to preserve the family's dignity. The most imaginative claimed she was a witch, born with power in her blood, sealed away to prevent catastrophe. But beneath all the rumors lay a single truth that none dared dispute: the harrows were hiding something, and that something had a name. Leora. No one had heard her speak. No one had seen her walk through the market or attend the solstice festivals as other children did. The only clue of her presence was a strange kind of absence, a space held open in the Harrow household that no one acknowledged, yet never filled. Even the house itself seemed shaped around her, like a breath held too long. The rooms upstairs were cleaned daily, though no one ever saw who did it. Meals were sometimes sent on trays that disappeared and returned untouched. And at night, the light in the backmost window, the one furthest from the village, would flicker like a heartbeat, soft and rhythmic, as if counting down. And still, the rule remained: do not ask about Leora. Do not seek her out. Do not knock on the locked doors or follow the music if you hear it. Because in the Harrow house, there were places that did not belong to time, or family, or even the living. And behind one of those many locked doors, the girl they had waited for something, or someone, who had not yet come. You said. Leora Harrow lived in the furthest room of the northern wing, a chamber swaddled in shadows even during the brightest part of the day. The walls were draped in deep blue fabric that drank in the light, and the floors were layered in rugs so thick her footsteps never made a sound. A fireplace at the far end kept the room from growing too cold, and the shelves that lined 3 of the walls were filled with books, ancient, soft-spined, and heavy with secrets. She had lived there as long as she could remember. She was not imprisoned, not exactly. The door was never locked, but it may as well have been. She had been told since childhood that her presence in the rest of the house, let alone the outside world, was not safe. Not for her, and not for others. It was always delivered gently, like a story meant to soothe. Some flowers bloom only in darkness, her mother once whispered while brushing her hair. You must stay here, where it's safe for you to grow. Leora had pale skin that barely knew sunlight. Her long black hair was soft and fine, combed daily by women who never met her eyes. Her eyes were large and gray, like the sky just before rain, and they seemed to see more than she let on. She wore gowns of soft linen and wool, stitched with simple patterns and silver thread, never the bright colors worn by other girls her age. Brightness, it seemed, was not meant for her. Her caretakers, 3 women known only as Mira, Helen, and Gilda, were not unkind. They brought her food on silver trays, hot tea in the mornings, and warm milk at night. They helped her dress, taught her embroidery, read with her from heavy old books. But they never laughed with her. They never shared stories of their own lives or touched her unless they had to. When they spoke her name, they did so with a hush, like someone invoking an old prayer or a forbidden spell. She had no mirrors in her room. No clock. No calendar. Only the light from her window and the changing seasons of the trees outside gave her a sense of time. She was forbidden to open the window. The wind is not good for you, Helen had said. It carries too much. That phrase had always puzzled Leora. Too much of what? Too much cold? Too much noise? But lately, the wind had changed. It had begun subtly. On certain days, when the wind rose in the afternoon, she thought she heard something, soft and faint, like a whisper threaded through the air. At first she believed it was her imagination, shaped by long hours of solitude and the stories in her books. But then the whisper came again. And again. Always when she was alone. Always just on the edge of what she could understand. Not a word, but a rhythm. Not a sound, but a pull. She began sitting at the window more often. She would place her hand on the cold glass, eyes scanning the distant trees where the wind came from. The forest swayed like a dark sea, and sometimes she felt it was swaying for her. Her breath would fog the glass, and she would write her name in it with a fingertip, Leora, just to see it written somewhere other than a book's dedication page. She started hearing it then. Her name. At first, it was only once. A breeze rushed in and brushed against the walls, and she could have sworn she heard it, Leora. Clear, soft, and deliberate. She froze, the book in her lap forgotten. She turned to the door, but no one was there. The room was still. The fire snapped quietly behind her. The next time, it was dusk, and the wind was stronger. The trees outside shook and danced, and the whisper came again, closer this time. Leora. Not a question, but a call. Not an echo, but a voice. She wanted to open the window. She needed to. Her fingers hovered over the latch more than once, but Myra's voice would rise in her mind, firm and almost panicked. Never open it. Never. So she didn't. But she leaned. She leaned into the glass like someone straining toward music just out of reach. Her heart beat faster. The air felt different. Thinner. She stopped sleeping soundly. Her dreams were thick with fog and voices she didn't know. She walked through halls that weren't in her house, through doors she had never seen before. In one dream, a boy with amber eyes stood in the middle of the forest and said her name with such sadness that she woke up crying. She couldn't remember his face, but his voice lingered in her bones. Leora didn't know why she had been hidden, not really. They'd told her it was for her safety, for everyone's safety. That she was special. That she was dangerous, though they never used that word. But she didn't feel dangerous. She felt forgotten. She felt as though she had been placed into a story she had never asked to be part of. And now that story was beginning to stir. Because the wind no longer passed her window. It stopped. It waited. And when it spoke her name. The storm came without warning, as storms often do in places where the sky holds its breath before unleashing its fury. One moment the air was dry and waiting, the next, the clouds rolled in like a siege. Thunder cracked in the distance, and the wind curled down from the mountains, dragging the rain behind it in sweeping curtains. Even the animals in the village took shelter early, as if they knew this storm was not like the others. The Harrow family rarely answered their own doors. But that evening, just as the storm reached its full voice, a knock echoed through the grand hall, steady, deliberate, too calm for someone caught in such weather. One of the footmen, new to the house and unacquainted with what not to do, opened it. The visitor stood with no umbrella, no hood, only a cloak slick with rain, and a small leather satchel slung over his back. He was young, perhaps in his early 20s, with dark hair that curled damply around his ears and a face that seemed both fresh and old at once. His eyes were what unsettled the servant most, not because they were harsh or wild, but because they were so calm. A calm that didn't belong to someone caught in a storm. A calm that knew too much. "I seek shelter," the young man said, voice smooth and quiet, but carrying weight. "Just until the storm passes." The Harrows, being nobles still bound to the laws of hospitality, could not refuse. The traveler was brought inside, and his cloak taken by one of the silent servants. He bowed slightly in thanks, and though his movements were graceful, there was a stiffness to them, as though he came from another time, where bowing and formality were more than politeness, they were law. When Lord Harrow came to greet him, the traveler bowed again, lower this time, and introduced himself as Corin. No surname, no title. Just Corin. "You've traveled far, then," Lord Harrow observed, his sharp eyes lingering a moment too long on Corin's boots, which bore not a trace of mud. "Where from?" "East of the ridges," Corin answered, neither lying nor revealing. "The storm drove me off the main road. I followed the old paths." At this, Lady Harrow appeared at the top of the stairs, a shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her expression froze for a second, just a second, when her gaze met Corin's. Then she descended slowly, her fingers gripping the banister with the same care one uses when approaching a wild animal. "We are a quiet household," she said as she greeted him. "You are welcome under our roof tonight. But you will obey our customs." "Of course," Corin said. "I am a guest, and I understand the importance of respect." She nodded. "Then let me be plain. The north wing of this house is not for visitors. You will remain in the guest chamber on the main floor. You will not wander. You will not ask questions." Corin inclined his head. "Understood." There was something in his voice that suggested he already knew. That perhaps he had known before he even knocked on the door. He was shown to a modest but richly appointed room near the library. The fire had already been lit. Clean towels were folded neatly beside the basin, and a small meal was laid out, spiced meat, bread, cheese, and wine so dark it nearly shimmered violet. Corin ate slowly, as though tasting not just the food but the air itself. He moved through the room with practiced ease, touching nothing he didn't need to, but observing everything. That evening, the storm shook the windows with real force. Trees bowed and groaned outside, and the wind scraped its long fingers across the walls of the house. The servants moved more quickly than usual, securing latches, reinforcing shutters. In the grand hall, the fire roared, and the family sat stiffly, sipping wine in silence. Corin joined them only briefly, sitting in a high-backed chair and saying little. His presence was not disruptive, he did not ask questions or insert himself, but there was something about him that shifted the room's weight. As though the house itself felt it. At one point, Corin looked up from his glass and turned his head slightly, as if listening to something behind the walls. "Quite a storm," he said lightly, breaking the silence. "Yes," Lord Harrow replied. "The wind finds its way into everything here." Corin gave a small, knowing smile. "I find wind to be a better messenger than most men." Lady Harrow set down her glass. Her hands trembled, just slightly. Her gaze flicked to her husband, and then to the great staircase. Corin followed it with his eyes, tracing the path up toward the darkened landing where the north wing began. His look was curious, but not eager. Thoughtful. Familiar, even. Later, after the family had retired and the house grew still, Corin remained in his guest room, pacing softly. He lit no candles, preferring the firelight. From his satchel, he drew a slim, leather-bound book, its cover worn, the pages thinner than breath. He opened it halfway, to a pressed flower that had long since lost its color but not its shape. He ran a finger along the brittle stem and closed the book again. The wind rose again, louder this time, and Corin stood. He walked to his window and looked out toward the edge of the estate. His eyes, lit faintly by the fire behind him, glinted gold for a moment. Then, from the far end of the house, a different wind stirred. A whisper that came not from the storm, but from within the house itself. It twisted through corridors and curled beneath doors. It was faint, so faint no one else would notice, but Corin heard it. And in the north wing, behind a closed door wrapped in silence and charm, a girl paused with her hand against her windowpane, heart pounding. Because for the first time, she didn't just hear her name whispered in the wind. She heard it spoken. And it was his voice that said it. The dining hall of the Harrow house, lit by low chandeliers and the flickering warmth of the hearth, had never felt more like a stage. Shadows danced on the walls, stretching long over the portraits of stern ancestors who looked down with their painted scorn. The air smelled faintly of rosemary and roasted meats, but beneath it lingered something colder, a tension that clung to every breath. Corin entered last, as a guest should, and bowed slightly to Lord and Lady Harrow before taking the seat assigned to him at the long, carved oak table. The table was too large for 5 people. Lord Harrow sat at the head, Lady Harrow at his right. Across from her were their 2 sons, Merrick and Elian, quiet young men with sharp eyes and tighter mouths. Corin's place had been set midway down the table, flanked by empty chairs. Except for one chair, near the foot of the table, set carefully with polished silverware, a crystal goblet, and a folded napkin atop a plate that remained untouched. It was not dusted with disuse, nor decorated as a gesture. It was a place meant to appear used, yet had not been touched in years. Corin's gaze paused there only for a second. Dinner began in silence. The servants moved swiftly in with practiced invisibility, pouring wine and presenting each course with mechanical precision. Dishes arrived and disappeared in a rhythm more precise than any village bell tower. Corin ate with quiet grace, but his eyes rarely left the family. He watched them the way one might watch a tapestry, not admiring the beauty but searching for flaws in the stitch. Finally, as the second course was cleared and a cool tart of lemon and sweet cream was placed before them, he spoke. "This house has a strong presence," he said, his voice smooth but edged with something too observant. "It's not just the structure. It feels full." Lady Harrow, never one for idle conversation, replied flatly, "It has stood for generations. History tends to leave an impression." Corin nodded, swirling his wine. "Indeed. It's almost as if the walls remember every name ever spoken within them." He looked up. "And every name not spoken as well." Lord Harrow set down his knife slowly. "What exactly are you implying?" Corin offered a gentle smile. "Nothing, of course. Only that I find it fascinating when households this old choose to carry history forward, selectively." Merrick shifted in his seat, glancing at his mother. Elian kept his eyes on his plate, hands still. Then Corin turned his head deliberately, looking at the empty place setting down the table. "And yet you've set a place for someone who's not here." Silence. Just the crackle of the fire. Lady Harrow did not look at the setting. "That place is ceremonial. Tradition." "Ah," Corin replied. He took a sip of wine. "Not unlike the way some families leave a candle in the window for the dead." "This is not a conversation for guests," Lord Harrow said, his tone not yet angry but firm, bordering on cold. Corin didn't look away. His voice, still soft, came like a key turning in a long-forgotten lock. "Where's the other daughter?" The air changed. Lady Harrow stiffened. Merrick gripped his fork a little too tightly. Elian froze altogether. "There is no daughter," Lord Harrow said. His voice had dropped low, but his words were carved from stone. Corin set down his wine. "I beg your pardon," he said, tone respectful but not retreating. "I was told there were 3 children." "You were told wrong," Lady Harrow said, her voice clipped, hands clenched together like she was holding something from spilling out. "We have 2 sons. That is all." Corin tilted his head. "And the name Leora? Was that, too, an invention?" The fork in Marek's hand clattered against his plate. Lady Harrow rose from her chair so fast her shawl slipped from her shoulders. "You will stop this now," she hissed. "You know nothing about this house." Corin's gaze never left hers. "I know enough." He stood, not in defiance, but in acknowledgement. "The wind speaks more truth than silence ever will," he said quietly. "And it's howling tonight." With that, he bowed, deep and old-fashioned, and left the table, his boots echoing in the heavy silence he left behind. Behind him, the fire snapped louder than before. And upstairs, in the north wing, Leora stood by the window, her breath fogging the glass. The wind outside whispered again. But this time, it wasn't alone. Someone knew her name. And now, someone had spoken it aloud. The house was quieter than it had ever been. Even the storm seemed to have grown tired, its howls softening to long, low sighs that pressed gently against the windows, as though mourning. Somewhere in the darkness between midnight and dawn, the Harrow estate held its breath. Corin moved silently through the halls. He walked with no candle, no lantern. He did not need one. His hand brushed the wall now and then, not for balance, but reverence, like greeting something old and familiar. The tapestries seemed to shift slightly as he passed. The doors, each carved with ornate family sigils and curling vines, stood still. But the air trembled, faintly, as if the house itself could feel what was coming. At the very end of the northern wing, he stopped. A thick door stood before him, twice locked and sealed with old charms carved into the wood. It had not been opened in nearly a decade. Dust clung to the frame, and a faint shimmer of old magic pulsed beneath the surface like veins under skin. To any other man, it would have been a wall. But Corin was not just any man. He placed his palm flat against it. "Leora," he whispered. Inside the room, Leora stirred. Her dreams had carried her far from her familiar cage. She wandered misty woods, beneath silver trees that hummed when the wind passed through them. The air shimmered with unseen song, and there, by the edge of a dark pool, stood a boy with amber eyes. He turned toward her, smiling. He raised one hand and whispered something she couldn't hear. But she felt it. Her name. Not spoken in warning or hush or fear. Spoken like a promise. Like someone who knew her, not her name as a burden, but as a truth. The wind picked up again, curling around her dream like a ribbon. Her name echoed in it, over and over, Leora. Leora. She woke, breath caught in her throat, a sheen of cold sweat on her forehead. The room was dark, except for the fading embers in the fireplace and the faint glow of moonlight through the window. She sat up slowly, brushing her hair back. The air was different. Thinner. Sharper. Alive. Then, click. The sound was quiet, almost too quiet to hear. But she did. A lock. Turning. She looked to the door. For years it had been just another wall. Her world had been bounded by that door and the window, and she had long accepted that they were not for her to pass. But the lock had turned. And now, so did the second. A soft hiss, like steam leaving a kettle, whispered into the room. She stood on bare feet, heart pounding, and approached the door. "Leora," came the voice again, muffled, as if through wood, but clear and close. Her name, from him. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. Her hand touched the doorknob. It was warm. And then, click, the last charm broke. She opened the door. The hallway beyond was dark, lit only by the pale moonlight that slanted in through tall windows. She took one tentative step across the threshold, then another. The air out here smelled different. Older. Heavy with the scent of dust and stone and stories untold. Her knees trembled, but she didn't stop. She walked down the corridor, her fingers trailing along the walls as if anchoring herself to something real. Then she saw him. Corin stood at the end of the hall, arms at his sides, his face half-shadowed. But his eyes, those amber eyes, glowed faintly in the dark. "You came," she said, barely above a whisper. "I've always been coming," he answered. She took another step. "Who are you?" He tilted his head, not in confusion, but consideration. "Someone who remembered when everyone else forgot. The others, they never said I was real. They treated me like a curse." "You were never a curse, Leora," he said. "You were a secret. But secrets don't stay buried forever." She reached him then. The hallway, impossibly long a moment ago, had shortened between heartbeats. They stood face to face, silent. He reached out and took her hand. It was the first time, in all her memory, that someone had touched her without flinching. And just like that, the hallway felt less dark. Less haunted. Behind them, the door to her room, her prison, swung shut on its own. But Leora didn't turn back. She was no longer waiting behind a window. She was walking into the story that had once been whispered, and now, finally, was beginning to be told. They sat in the quiet drawing room at the far end of the north wing, a place thick with dust and untouched linens, long abandoned by servants. Moonlight spilled through the tall windows in pale, silken streaks, illuminating the motes that danced in the air around them. The storm had passed, and now everything felt suspended in that breathless silence between night and dawn, the time when secrets slip through cracks and truths can be spoken without the weight of consequence. Leora sat curled in an old velvet chair, her bare feet tucked beneath her, a thick shawl draped over her shoulders. Across from her, Corin rested on the edge of a long chaise, elbows on his knees, hands clasped loosely. He looked at her not with curiosity, but with recognition. Neither had spoken in the first few minutes. The silence wasn't awkward, it was necessary. It allowed Leora to adjust to the sheer strangeness of being outside her room, to the reality of being seen without fear. It gave Corin the space to watch her, not like a specimen, but like a living answer to an old riddle. "You knew my name," she finally said, her voice fragile and hoarse from years of speaking only to herself in the wind. Corin nodded. "Yes. You said it like," she hesitated. "Like it meant something." "It does," he said. "Names always do. Especially the ones people try to forget." She looked away. "They never forgot it. They just refused to say it. Like it would wake something." Corin tilted his head, studying her. "And did it?" She smiled faintly, sad and soft. "Maybe." Corin leaned back and folded his arms. "Would you like to hear a story?" She blinked. "Now?" "There's never been a better time." She hesitated, then nodded. So he began, not with a preamble or a flourish, but simply with the ease of someone reciting something long memorized. "There was once a village far from here, older than roads and deeper than maps. In that village, a child was born beneath a night without stars. The wind refused to blow that evening, and even the wolves in the hills kept silent." Leora's breath caught. Already, she knew this story. The midwives whispered that the child's birth was wrong. That something ancient had stirred in the bloodline. They saw signs, eyes that gleamed in the dark, a heartbeat that echoed through walls, a silence that could choke a room when the girl cried. Leora's eyes locked on his. He continued. "The elders consulted their books and their fears and decided that she was too dangerous to be raised like other children. So they made a choice, to hide her. For her safety, yes, but mostly for theirs. They built a chamber lined with ashwood and silver charms. They said it was love. But it was fear." Leora's throat tightened. She knew how the rest would go. And yet she needed to hear it. Needed him to say it out loud. "The girl grew," Corin said softly, "but the walls grew with her. Her world was made of shadows, silence, and forgotten promises. They told her she was fragile, but what they meant was that they were. He paused. But the wind never forgot her name. And neither did someone who had once seen her, not in a dream, but in a vision. Leora sat upright. A vision? Corin nodded. Some people see with their eyes. Others see with memory. Or duty. Or fate. He smiled gently. Let's just say this tale is older than both of us, and yet, here we are, living it again. Her hands tightened around the shawl. You're speaking as if it's all happened already. He didn't answer right away. Then, in a way, it has. And in another, it's only just beginning. Leora stood, slowly pacing to the window. Her reflection stared back at her, pale, thin, eyes too wide for her face, like a candle afraid to go out. What happened to the girl? She asked. Corin didn't move. Some say she burned the house down. Others say she simply vanished, taken by the wind that had waited for her all those years. But what do you say? He looked at her, and this time, his voice was sure. I say she was never meant to stay locked away. I say her gift was not to be feared, but understood. Leora turned, her breath catching. You're not just a traveler, are you? No, he said quietly. I'm the one who remembered when everyone else chose to forget. They stood facing each other in the soft silver light. Neither moved. Neither spoke. But the story, the one no one had dared tell, was no longer just a folktale. It was alive again. Long ago, before the village had stone paths or bell towers, before the Harrow family wore silk and lived in manors, they were keepers of the forest edge, simple, proud, and fearful of what they did not control. The trees back then were wilder, hungering. Spirits whispered in their branches and shifted between the shadows. One such spirit, a guardian of balance, older than seasons, watched the Harrow bloodline closely. For within it, sometimes, something woke. Something powerful. A child would be born now and then with a mark. Not always visible. Not always clear. But the spirit would feel it, woven into the soul like a thread of fire waiting to be pulled. The Harrows feared the forest, but they feared the marked more. So they made a pact. A night under a red moon, the Harrow patriarch stood at the roots of the oldest tree, with offerings in both hands and desperation in his heart. The spirit listened. Keep our family safe, the man had begged. Let our name continue, let our blood prosper. Just, take them. The marked ones. Hide them. Silence them. Do what we cannot. The spirit did not agree to cruelty. But it agreed to silence. And so the pact was made, the Harrows would remain protected, respected, untroubled, so long as they sealed away any child born with the mark. No fire. No light. No names spoken beyond their birth. If they honored the silence, they would thrive. And they did. For 100 years, not a single marked child came. The tale became a whisper, then a warning, then forgotten entirely by most. Only the family elders kept the knowledge, and only in locked books and sealed rooms. Until Leora. She had not screamed when she was born, but the wind had howled. The fire in the hearth had died. The midwife had fled and never returned. Her eyes, even as an infant, were strange, lit from within, like the last gleam of a candle just before it goes out. The old pact was remembered. The room was built. The house grew around it, with locked doors and rituals in silence. They told themselves it was mercy. Now, in the stillness of that long-abandoned parlor, Leora stood across from Corin as he spoke, not with judgment, but with weariness. I am not just a traveler, he said. I am the other half of the pact. She stared at him, breath shallow. You're the spirit? He smiled faintly. Not quite. I was born of it. Bound to it. A child of its will. I walk among those who forget their promises, and remind them. Leora's voice trembled. So you came to take me away? No, he said gently. That was never the pact. I came to see if they kept their word. She looked down, her fists clenched. They did. Yes, Corin said. They locked you away. They honored the silence. But the wind does not like cages. And neither do you. He stepped closer, slowly. You weren't meant to be a prisoner, Leora. The pact was protection, not punishment. But men twist even sacred agreements when fear becomes tradition. Leora's eyes burned, not with tears, but with something deeper. A flicker of that same fire the midwife had seen long ago. I want to be seen, she whispered. Corin nodded. Then it's time the pact was rewritten. He held out his hand, not in command, but in offering. And for the first time in generations, a marked harrow reached back. The house was silent when they returned. Corin walked beside her like a shadow with purpose, his steps quiet but certain. Leora followed not because he led, but because every hallway now felt too small, every wall too close. The truth was a bell that had rung inside her, echoing, vibrating, and it could not be unrung. They reached the front of the house just as the family began to stir. The eldest brother, Aldrich, appeared first, his dressing gown half-tied, hair tousled, face pale with sleep, or dread. Behind him came Mother, her spine stiff as glass, and Father, weary and silent, as if the years had suddenly caught up to him all at once. The servants lingered behind, wide-eyed and breathless, unsure whether they should watch or flee. Leora stood in the center of them all, no longer ghost or rumor. They looked at her like she had risen from a grave. Leora, Mother whispered. What are you doing out here? She knows, Corin said. About the pact. About the mark. About what she was never allowed to be. The color drained from her father's face. This isn't how it was meant to happen. It never is, Corin replied calmly. Mother turned toward Leora, desperate now. You don't understand what's out there. What the world does to those who are different. I know what you did to me, Leora said, her voice steadier than it had ever been. You locked me away before I could even decide what I was. We protected you, Aldrich said firmly. There are people out there who would have torn you apart out of fear. We kept you safe. No, she said, you kept yourselves safe. The room fell silent. A tremble passed through the rafters, soft but distinct, like the house itself had heard her and was unsure how to respond. Father stepped forward, his voice quiet but heavy. We made a promise. It was the only way to preserve our bloodline. To protect all of us. That's why we hid the marked. It was never meant to be cruel. And yet it was, Corin murmured. Leora looked at them, not as parents, not as protectors, but as people. People who had chosen silence over truth. Comfort over courage. She felt something stirring inside her, not just anger, but power. A pressure she had long mistaken for fear now swelled and pulsed, demanding to be seen. I don't belong here anymore, she said. Mother reached for her arm, pleading. If you leave, there's no undoing it. That power, it will change you. You don't know how to control it. You don't know what you are. Leora pulled away gently. You're right. I don't. But I never will if I stay here. You'll be alone. She won't, Corin said simply. Leora turned toward him. Why me? Why now? Because your name was never meant to be buried. It means light in the shadow. You were born to walk through darkness, not live in it. Her breath caught. She had never been told what her name meant. They had always spoken it like a curse. Now it felt like a key. She looked once more at her family. You said the world would destroy me. But you never gave me the chance to prove it wrong. Father's mouth opened but no words came. For the first time in her life, Leora saw him uncertain. Human. Not the warden of her cage, but another prisoner of fear. The wind stirred again, soft but clear, curling around her like a familiar hand brushing her cheek. It whispered nothing this time. It didn't have to. It had waited long enough. Leora turned away from them all, stepped toward the door. It creaked open on its own, slow and deliberate. Morning light poured through in amber hues, catching in her hair, lighting her pale skin with a gentle, otherworldly glow. Corin followed, pausing just long enough to look back at the stunned Harrow family. "She chose," he said. "Let that be the end of silence." And with that, they walked out. Leora did not look back. The moment Leora stepped over the threshold, something ancient stirred. It began with the wind. Not a gust or a howl, but a low, humming breath that coiled around her ankles like a curious animal, then climbed gently up her frame. It teased the edges of her shawl, lifted her hair in slow, deliberate strands, and brushed against her cheek like a greeting long overdue. The morning light was gold, too deep, and the trees outside the Harrow estate leaned ever so slightly inward. Their leaves shimmered not green but silver in the sun, as if bathed in something older than daylight. Leora felt it immediately, the weight that had lived in her chest her whole life, dull, constant, invisible, had shifted. No, not lifted. It had uncoiled. What had once felt like pressure now pulsed with rhythm. Her limbs felt longer somehow, her fingertips more sensitive to the air. The world wasn't larger. She was. Beside her, Corin said nothing. He watched, eyes soft, knowing this was not a moment for instruction, but for memory. For recognition. This was the part no mentor could teach. The wind twined up her spine now, and she let it. She stood taller, the shawl slipping off her shoulders. Her skin glowed, not with fire, but with presence. A shimmer, like moonlight on still water, moved beneath her skin in waves. Her eyes, always too wide, now held no fear. Only clarity. And then the earth itself responded. The roots beneath the path shivered. The grass leaned inward. Not submission, but welcome. Birdsong quieted. The forest paused. And then, from somewhere deep in the glade beyond, a sound rose, not a howl, not a song. A note. Long and low and pure, as though the world had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Leora took one step forward. And her feet did not quite touch the ground. She floated, barely, just a whisper of height, but it was enough. Enough to know she had never truly belonged in that house, with its walls and locks and lies. She had been a story misplaced, kept on the wrong page for too long. Her fingers trembled as she raised them, not in fear but awe. With every breath, she felt herself becoming. The shimmer beneath her skin danced like starlight now. The wind no longer whispered to her, it waited. "What is this?" she asked, her voice no longer just her own. It echoed, faintly, with something behind it. Something more. "It's who you've always been," Corin said, stepping closer. "The fear wasn't of you. It was of this. Of the moment you stopped being small." She turned to him, light pooling in her eyes. "They thought hiding me would protect the world." He nodded. "But the world never asked for that. It asked for you. All of you." She looked ahead to the woods, where the trees bent toward her, beckoning. Leora inhaled deeply, and the air responded, cool and sharp and full of promise. She walked forward again, barefoot, light on the wind. And with every step, the old silence cracked and crumbled behind her. The sky darkened at noon. Not with storm clouds, but with something more deliberate. The light pulled back as if the sun itself wished to look away. Shadows grew long and cold across the Harrow estate, and the birds that usually sang at midday went mute. Inside the house, the walls began to groan. It started low, a sound beneath hearing, more felt than heard, a slow vibration through the floorboards, the foundation, the bones of the place. Dust fell from chandeliers that hadn't swayed in decades. Portraits twisted on their hooks. The hearthstone cracked clean across its center. In the drawing room, the Harrow family stood frozen. Leora had returned, not alone. Corin stood at her side, eyes solemn, every line in his posture sharp as a blade. Behind them, from the tree line at the edge of the property, emerged the spirits. Not ghostly figures or beasts of lore, but presences. Shapes that shimmered like heat, walked without steps, and carried silence like a weapon. The forest had come to collect its debt. Leora did not speak. She stood at the threshold, unblinking. The shimmer beneath her skin had intensified, a veil of moonlight wrapped around her form. She was not just the girl they had hidden. She was the reckoning itself. Aldrich stepped forward, shaking. This was never meant to happen. No, said Corin quietly. But it did. You broke the pact, not by hiding her, but by never intending to free her. The pact was for silence, not prison. Reverence, not fear. Mother reached for Leora, pleading. You were born wrong. We didn't know what else to do. I was born different, Leora corrected. Her voice was soft, but it cut like a blade. You turned love into a sentence. The house moaned louder, the walls warping ever so slightly. The spirits advanced, slow, steady, neither cruel nor merciful. They did not shout or strike. They watched. And in that watching, truth bloomed painfully. Father fell to his knees. We were trying to protect our name. Our bloodline. We did what the pact required. No, said Corin, stepping forward. You did what your fear required. And then, the judgment came. It wasn't fire or storm. It was memory. Each member of the Harrow family was made to relive the moment they agreed to her silence. The decisions. The justifications. The way they turned their backs on her cries, her questions. The way they avoided her name. And when the visions faded, they were left changed, not destroyed, but stripped. Empty of their illusions, laid bare by what they had done. The spirits turned to Leora. She looked at her family, not with hatred, but with mourning. For what could have been. Then she turned her back on them, once and for all. The spirits followed her as she walked out of the house. Corin beside her. The wind stirred, lifting the dust and taking with it the final echo of the pact, unwritten, undone, and forgotten no more. The house stood, but it would never breathe the same again. 12. Epilogue, a name remembered, 600 words. Years passed. The Harrow estate, once proud and gleaming, aged quickly after the day the wind changed. Paint peeled. Gardens withered. Guests stopped coming. The village spoke of a heaviness there, like the house had been turned inside out, hollowed by the truth it once buried. And Leora? Well, no one could say for sure. Some said she had vanished entirely, taken into the forest as payment to the old gods for the Harrow family's broken promise. Others claimed they'd seen her on the edge of the woods, barefoot, glowing faintly beneath the moonlight, speaking to trees as if they spoke back. The children in the village grew up hearing stories about her. They'd dare each other to walk the northern woods, whisper her name 3 times, and wait to see if the leaves would stir in response. Some swore they heard a voice, soft, warm, warning. A merchant once claimed that while passing the Harrow grounds, he'd seen a pale figure standing behind a window, watching him with eyes that shimmered like moonlight. But when he looked again, she was gone. Old folk said she had become something new, neither spirit nor mortal. A guardian. A balance keeper. A reminder that silence is not the same as peace. Still, there were those who whispered of one final tale. That on a cold night, years later, a visitor came to the Harrow estate. He wore a long coat, spoke in an older dialect, and carried a name few remembered. He knocked once. Twice. And when the door opened, he said only one thing. I'm here to see Leora. No one answered. But a wind rose, quick and sharp, and every door in the house slammed shut behind him. They say he walked through, as if guided. And when he left, he was not alone. Now, when travelers come to the village and ask about the Harrows, they are told only this. If a guest ever asks for someone you've hidden, listen closely. The wind has a memory. And so does she. Her name is no longer buried. It moves on the air, soft but sure. Leora. Light in the shadow. And she is watching still.